In 1939, the world stood on the brink of total war. This video will take you through how a clash along the distant Mongolian steppe brought Soviet commander Georgy Zhukov his first significant victory over Japan, influencing Tokyo's future military strategies. You'll discover how, in Europe, Hitler made a shocking agreement with Stalin to split Eastern Europe, setting the stage for the invasion of Poland. You'll see how Britain and France struggled between caution and action as they edged closer to war, while the early days of the conflict saw widespread bombings, civilian slaughter, and the merciless occupation of a nation. This narrative reveals how the political maneuvers, covert agreements, and brutal battles of 1939 ignited the fuse for the Second World War. On June 1st, 1939, Georgy Zhukov, a compact cavalry commander, received an urgent call to Moscow. The ongoing purge of the Red Army, which began in 1937, led Zhukov to fear he had been labeled an enemy of the people after already facing accusations. He anticipated the worst, that he would fall into the hands of Lavrenti Beria's notorious interrogation system. In the fearful atmosphere of the Great Terror, high-ranking officers were among the first to be executed as alleged Trotskyite fascist spies. Approximately 30,000 were arrested, with many senior officers shot and others tortured into making absurd confessions. Since the purge began 2 years earlier, Zhukov, close to several victims, had kept a bag packed for prison. Anticipating this moment, he penned a farewell letter to his wife, starting with a request for her not to succumb to despair and to endure the unpleasant separation with dignity. However, upon arriving in Moscow by train the following day, he was neither arrested nor taken to Lubyanka prison. Instead, he was directed to the Kremlin to meet Marshal Klement Voroshilov, an old associate of Stalin's from the Civil War, who now served as the People's Commissar of Defense. This mediocre, faceless soldier had bolstered his position by eagerly eliminating capable commanders during the purge. Nikita Khrushchev bluntly referred to him as the biggest bag of shit in the army. Zhukov learned that he was to be sent to the Soviet satellite state of Outer Mongolia. He was set to lead the 57th Special Corps, consisting of both Red Army and Mongolian troops, aiming to deliver a significant blow to the Imperial Japanese Army. Stalin was frustrated by the local commander's apparent lack of progress. With the threat of war looming from Hitler in the West, he sought to put an end to Japanese provocations from the puppet state of Manchukuo. The rivalry between Russia and Japan stretched back to Tsarist times, and the Soviet regime had not forgotten the humiliating defeat in 1905. Under Stalin, their strength in the Far East had significantly increased. The Japanese military was preoccupied with the fear of Bolshevism. Following the signing of the Anti-Comintern Pact between Germany and Japan in November 1936, tensions along the Mongolian border escalated between the Red Army and the Japanese Kwantung Army. This tension surged due to a series of border confrontations in 1937, culminating in the major Changkufeng incident at Lake Khasan in 1938, located 110 kilometers southwest of Vladivostok. The Japanese were also infuriated by the Soviet Union's support for their Chinese adversaries, which included not only economic aid but also T-26 tanks, a significant number of military advisors, and volunteer air units. Frustration grew among the leaders of the Kwantung Army regarding Emperor Hirohito's hesitation in August 1938 to permit a strong response against the Soviets. Their confidence was rooted in the erroneous belief that the Soviet Union wouldn't retaliate. They sought unrestricted freedom to act in any future border conflicts. Their motives were selfish. A minor conflict with the Soviet Union would compel Tokyo to bolster the Kwantung Army instead of downsizing it. They worried that some of their units could be redirected south to engage in the war against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces. There was some backing within the Imperial General Staff in Tokyo for the aggressive stance of the Kwantung leadership. However, the Navy and civilian politicians were deeply apprehensive. Pressure from Nazi Germany urging Japan to see the Soviet Union as the primary enemy made them quite uneasy. They wanted to avoid entanglement in a northern war along the Mongolian and Siberian borders. This divide ultimately led to the downfall of Prince Konoe Fumamaro's government. Nevertheless, the debate within senior government and military circles persisted as the prospect of war in Europe became increasingly apparent. The army and far-right groups highlighted and often inflated the increasing number of clashes along the northern frontiers. The Kwantung Army, without consulting Tokyo, issued an order allowing the local commander to act as he deemed necessary to punish the culprits. This was justified by the so-called prerogative of field initiative, which permitted armies to deploy troops for security reasons within their own area without the need for approval from the Imperial General Staff. The Nomonhan incident, which the Soviets later called the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, began on May 12, 1939. A Mongolian cavalry unit crossed the Khalkhin Gol to graze their hardy little horses on the expansive rolling steppe. They moved about 20 kilometers from the river, which the Japanese considered the border, to the large village of Nomonhan, identified by the Mongolian People's Republic as lying on the boundary line. Manchurian forces from the Kwantung Army drove them back to the Khalkhin Gol, only for the Mongolians to launch a counteroffensive. For nearly 2 weeks, skirmishes continued back and forth. The Red Army sent in reinforcements. On May 28th, Soviet and Mongolian forces overwhelmed a Japanese contingent of 200 men, along with some outdated armored vehicles. By mid-June, Red Army bombers targeted various positions while their ground forces advanced into Nomonhan. The situation escalated swiftly. Red Army units in the region received additional troops from the Trans-Baikal Military District, as Zhukov had requested after his arrival on June 5th. A significant challenge for the Soviet forces was operating over 650 kilometers from the nearest railhead, demanding immense logistical efforts with trucks traveling on dirt roads so poor that a round trip took 5 days. This daunting obstacle led the Japanese to underestimate the fighting strength of the forces Zhukov was gathering. They dispatched the 23rd Division under Lieutenant General Komatsubara Michitaro and part of the 7th Division to Nomonhan. The Kwantung Army insisted on a vastly increased air presence to support its troops, raising concerns in Tokyo. The Imperial General Staff issued an order prohibiting retaliatory strikes and announced that one of their officers would come to assess the situation. This news spurred the Kwantung commanders to finish the operation before any restrictions were imposed. On the morning of June 27th, Japanese air squadrons targeted Soviet positions in Outer Mongolia. The Tokyo General Staff was infuriated and immediately issued orders to halt any further aerial operations. That night, July 1st, Japanese troops surged across the Khalkhin Gol, capturing a crucial hill that threatened the Soviet flank. However, after 3 days of intense conflict, Zhukov managed to push them back across the river in a counter-offensive using his tanks. He then took control of part of the eastern bank and initiated his grand deception, known to the Red Army as Maskirovka. While secretly organizing a significant attack, his troops created the illusion of a stable defensive front. Poorly encrypted messages requested an increasing amount of materials for bunkers, loudspeakers mimicked the sounds of construction work, and pamphlets titled "What the Soviet Soldier Must Know in Defense" were abundantly distributed, ensuring that some reached enemy hands. Meanwhile, Zhukov was secretly bringing in tank reinforcements under the cover of night and hiding them well. His truck drivers worked tirelessly, transporting enough ammunition reserves for the offensive along the rough roads from the supply point. On July 23rd, the Japanese launched another direct assault, but they could not penetrate the Soviet line. Their own supply issues forced them to delay before attempting a third attack. Unbeknownst to them, Zhukov had bolstered his forces to 58,000 troops, supported by nearly 500 tanks and 250 aircraft. At 5:45 a.m. on Sunday, August 20th, Zhukov began his surprise offensive. He initiated a 3-hour artillery barrage before deploying tanks, aircraft, infantry, and cavalry. The heat was unbearable, with temperatures rising above 40 degrees Celsius, causing machine guns and cannons to jam while dust and smoke from explosions obscured the battlefield. As Soviet infantry, including 3 rifle divisions and a paratroop brigade, held their positions in the center, drawing in most of the Japanese forces, Zhukov launched his 3 armored brigades and a Mongolian cavalry division in encircling maneuvers from behind. His tanks, which crossed a tributary of the Khalkhin Gol at top speed, included T-26, previously used in the Spanish Civil War to aid the Republicans, as well as faster prototypes of what would later become the T-34, the most effective medium tank of the Second World War. The outdated Japanese tanks stood little chance. Their weapons couldn't fire armor-piercing shells. Even without effective anti-tank guns, Japanese infantry fought fiercely. Lieutenant Sadakaji was seen charging a tank with his samurai sword until he was cut down. Japanese soldiers held their ground from earthen bunkers, inflicting significant casualties on their attackers, some of whom resorted to using flamethrower tanks. Zhukov remained undeterred by his own losses. When the commander of the Trans-Baikal Front, there to observe the battle, suggested pausing the offensive, Zhukov dismissed him outright. He argued that if they halted the attack, only to resume later, Soviet losses would skyrocket due to their indecisiveness. Despite the Japanese resolve to never surrender, the Kwantung Army's outdated tactics and weaponry led to a devastating defeat. Komatsubara's forces were encircled and nearly annihilated in a brutal massacre, suffering 61,000 casualties. The Red Army faced 7,974 killed and 15,251 wounded. By the morning of August 31st, the battle came to a close. During this time, the Nazi-Soviet pact had been signed in Moscow, and as the battle ended, German troops gathered at the Polish borders, poised to initiate war in Europe. Isolated skirmishes persisted until mid-September, but Stalin, considering the global situation, deemed it wise to agree to Japanese requests for a ceasefire. Zhukov, who had returned to Moscow fearing arrest, now received from Stalin the Gold Star of Hero of the Soviet Union. His first victory marked a bright spot in a dark time for the Red Army, with far-reaching implications. The unexpected defeat deeply unsettled the Japanese, while both nationalist and communist Chinese forces found encouragement. In Tokyo, the Strike North faction advocating war against the Soviet Union suffered a major setback, while the Navy-led Strike South faction gained dominance. In April 1941, much to Berlin's dismay, a Soviet-Japanese non-aggression pact would be signed, just weeks before Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. The Battle of Khalkhin Gol significantly impacted Japan's choice to target the colonies of France, the Netherlands, and Britain in Southeast Asia, and even to confront the United States Navy in the Pacific. Tokyo's decision not to attack the Soviet Union during the winter of 1941 would be a pivotal factor in the war's geopolitical shift, both in the Far East and in Hitler's desperate conflict with the Soviets. Hitler's approach before the war lacked consistency. He occasionally considered forming an alliance with Britain before ultimately planning to strike the Soviet Union, aiming first to incapacitate Britain by launching a preemptive attack on France. To safeguard his Eastern Front in case he initiated a Western offensive, Hitler urged his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, to seek an alliance with Poland. The Polish, aware of the risks of inciting Stalin and rightly suspecting Hitler's intentions toward their nation, were very cautious. However, the Polish government made a significant error driven by opportunism. When Germany entered the Sudetenland in 1938, Polish forces occupied the Czechoslovak region of Teschen, which they had claimed since 1920, and advanced their border in the Carpathian Mountains. This action irritated the Soviets and concerned the British and French governments. Polish overconfidence played into Hitler's strategy. Their vision of forming a Central European coalition against German expansion, dubbed a Third Europe, was nothing but an illusion. On March 8, 1939, just before his troops occupied Prague and the rest of Czechoslovakia, Hitler informed his generals of his plan to crush Poland, asserting that Germany would gain from Polish resources and dominate Central Europe. He decided to secure Poland's subservience through conquest rather than negotiation, paving the way for his westward aggression. He also expressed his intention to dismantle what he termed the Jewish democracy of the United States. On March 23rd, he seized the Memel district from Lithuania to incorporate it into East Prussia, accelerating his war plans due to fears that British and French rearmament would soon catch up. Yet he still underestimated Chamberlain's guarantee to Poland, announced in the House of Commons on March 31st. On April 3rd, he instructed his generals to devise plans for Operation White, an invasion of Poland that needed to be ready by the end of August. Chamberlain, hesitant to engage with Stalin due to his strong anti-communist views and a skewed perception of Polish strength, was slow to establish a defensive alliance against Hitler in Central Europe and the Balkans. The British guarantee to Poland inadvertently excluded the Soviet Union. Chamberlain's government only began to address this significant oversight when reports emerged about German-Soviet trade discussions. Stalin, who despised the Poles, was profoundly worried about the British and French governments' failure to confront Hitler. Their previous exclusion of him from talks regarding Czechoslovakia only fueled his bitterness. He suspected that the British and French aimed to entangle him in conflict with Germany to avoid their own involvement. Naturally, he preferred to see the capitalist nations embroiled in their own extensive conflict. On April 18th, Stalin tested the British and French by proposing an alliance with a pact that offered support to any Central European nation threatened by an aggressor. The British were uncertain about how to respond. The initial response from both Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, and Sir Alexander Cadogan, his permanent undersecretary, was to view the Soviet overture as potentially harmful. Chamberlain worried that agreeing to it would simply provoke Hitler. In reality, it pushed the Führer to pursue his own agreement with the Soviet leader. Meanwhile, both the Poles and Romanians were skeptical, rightly concerned that the Soviet Union would seek permission for Red Army troops to move through their lands. Conversely, the French, who had viewed Russia as a natural ally against Germany since before the First World War, were more enthusiastic about a Soviet partnership. However, they felt they could not proceed without British support, and thus pressured London to agree to joint military discussions with the Soviet regime. Stalin was not swayed by the cautious British response, but he had his own hidden motives for pushing the Soviet borders further west. He was already eyeing Bessarabia in Romania, Finland, the Baltic states, and eastern Poland, particularly the areas of Belarusia and Ukraine that Poland had gained after its success in 1920. The British finally recognized the importance of forming an agreement with the Soviet Union, only beginning negotiations at the end of May. However, Stalin had valid reasons to believe that the British were merely stalling. His lack of confidence grew when the Franco-British military delegation, led by General Aimé Doumenc and Admiral Sir Reginald Plunkett Earl Drax, sailed to Leningrad on a slow ship on August 5th. They had no authority to make decisions and could only relay information back to their governments. Their mission was fated for failure due to other issues. Doumenc and Drax struggled against Stalin's demand for transit rights for Red Army troops through Polish and Romanian land, a request that neither country was willing to accept. Both nations held deep-seated suspicions towards communists, especially Stalin. As the unproductive talks dragged into mid-August, even the desperate French could not sway the Polish government on this issue. Polish Commander-in-Chief Marshal Edward Rydz-Śmigły expressed the sentiment that aligning with the Germans would mean losing their freedom, while aligning with the Russians could cost them their very soul. In response to British and French efforts to include Romania in a defensive pact against further German aggression, Hitler began to contemplate the unsettling idea of a Nazi-Soviet pact. On August 2nd, Ribbentrop first raised the possibility of a new relationship with the Soviet Chargé d'Affaires in Berlin, claiming that every issue from the Baltic to the Black Sea could be resolved jointly. He was upfront about Germany's intentions towards Poland and hinted at dividing the spoils. Just 2 days later, the German ambassador in Moscow implied that Germany would regard the Baltic states as part of the Soviet sphere of influence. On August 14th, Ribbentrop proposed visiting Moscow for talks. Vyacheslav Molotov, the new Soviet foreign minister, expressed worries about German backing for Japan, which was still engaged in conflict with the Red Army near the Khalkhin Gol, yet he showed a willingness to continue discussions, particularly concerning the Baltic states. For Stalin, the advantages of this potential agreement became increasingly clear. In fact, he had been contemplating a deal with Hitler since the Munich Agreement. In the spring of 1939, preparations escalated. On May 3rd, NKVD troops surrounded the Foreign Affairs Commissariat. Stalin had instructed to purge the Ministry of Jews and to clean out the synagogue. Maxim Litvinov, the seasoned Soviet diplomat, was replaced by Molotov, and several other Jews were arrested. An agreement with Hitler would enable Stalin to take over the Baltic states and Bessarabia and eastern Poland if Germany invaded from the west. Anticipating that Hitler would target France and Britain next, Stalin hoped to see German strength diminished in what he expected would be a bloody conflict with the capitalist West. This would provide him the opportunity to rebuild the Red Army, which had been weakened and demoralized by his purges. For Hitler, striking a deal with Stalin meant he could kick off his war, first against Poland, then against France and Britain, even without allies. The Pact of Steel with Italy, signed on May 22nd, was largely insignificant, since Mussolini believed his nation wouldn't be prepared for war until 1943. Nonetheless, Hitler was betting that Britain and France would hesitate to engage in war when he invaded Poland, despite their assurances. Nazi propaganda against Poland ramped up, laying the blame for the impending invasion squarely on the Poles. Hitler took every measure to avoid negotiations, determined not to be stalled by last-minute concessions. To rally German support, he tapped into their deep-seated grievances against Poland, which had gained West Prussia and part of Silesia through the despised Versailles settlement. The Free City of Danzig and the Polish Corridor, created to give Poland access to the Baltic and separating East Prussia from the Reich, were portrayed as two of the greatest injustices of the treaty. Yet, on May 23rd, the Führer stated that the upcoming war wasn't about Danzig, but rather a struggle for Lebensraum in the East. Reports of oppression against the 1 million ethnic Germans in Poland were grossly exaggerated. It was no surprise that Hitler's threats towards Poland led to discriminatory actions against ethnic Germans, resulting in about 70,000 fleeing to the Reich by late August. Claims from Poland that ethnic Germans had engaged in subversive activities prior to the conflict were likely unfounded. Allegations in the Nazi press about the persecution of ethnic Germans in Poland were presented dramatically. On August 17th, during German army maneuvers on the River Elbe, 2 British embassy captains, invited to observe, noted that the younger German officers were quite self-assured, confident that the army could take on anyone. In contrast, the generals and senior officials in the foreign ministry were anxious that invading Poland would spark a European war. Hitler remained convinced that the British would not engage in conflict. He believed that his upcoming pact with the Soviet Union would calm those generals anxious about facing a war on 2 fronts. However, on August 19th, to prepare for the possibility of war being declared by the British and French, Gross-Admiral Erich Raeder ordered the speedy battlecruisers known as pocket battleships, Deutschland and Graf Spee, along with 16 U-boats, to set sail for the Atlantic. On August 21st at 11:30, the German Foreign Ministry on the Wilhelmstrasse announced a proposed non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. When the news of Stalin's agreement to talks reached Hitler at his Alpine retreat in Berchtesgaden, he reportedly pumped his fists in triumph and banged the table, exclaiming to those around him, "I've got them! I've got them!" A member of the British embassy noted the excitement among Germans in cafes who believed this would lead to peace. Soon after, Ambassador Sir Neville Henderson informed London that the initial reaction in Berlin was one of great relief, reaffirming the German people's faith in Hitler's ability to achieve his goals without war. The British were unsettled by the news, but for the French, who relied heavily on a pact with their traditional ally Russia, it was shocking. Ironically, both Franco in Spain and the Japanese leadership felt betrayed, having received no warning that the initiator of the Anti-Comintern Pact was now pursuing an alliance with Moscow. The Japanese government crumbled under the shock, but it also dealt a significant blow to Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists. On August 23rd, Ribbentrop made his significant journey to the Soviet capital. There were few major disagreements in the negotiations, as the 2 totalitarian regimes secretly divided Central Europe between them. Stalin insisted on the entirety of Latvia, and Ribbentrop agreed after getting Hitler's swift approval over the phone. After both the public non-aggression pact and the secret protocols were signed, Stalin raised a toast to Hitler, remarking to Ribbentrop how much the German people revere their Führer. That same day, Sir Neville Henderson flew to Berchtesgaden with a letter from Chamberlain, hoping to avert war. However, Hitler simply blamed the British for encouraging Poland's anti-German stance. Henderson, despite being a staunch appeaser, became convinced that the corporal of the last war was eager to showcase his power as a conquering generalissimo this time. Later that night, Hitler ordered the army to prepare for an invasion of Poland just 3 days later. At 3 in the morning on August 24th, the British Embassy in Berlin received a telegram from London with the code word Rache. Diplomats, some still in their pajamas, began to burn sensitive documents. By midday, a warning was sent to all British citizens to leave the country. The ambassador, despite being weary from his journey to Berchtesgaden, still played bridge that evening with his staff. The next day, Henderson met with Hitler, who had come to Berlin. The Führer proposed a pact with Britain after occupying Poland, but grew frustrated when Henderson stated that an agreement would require Hitler to cease his aggression and withdraw from Czechoslovakia. Once more, Hitler declared that if war was inevitable, it should happen now, and not when he was in his 50s or 60s. That evening, to Hitler's genuine astonishment, the Anglo-Polish Pact was officially signed. In Berlin, British diplomats braced for the worst. One of them wrote that they had moved their personal belongings into the embassy ballroom, which resembled a chaotic train station. German embassies and consulates in Britain, France, and Poland were instructed to tell German nationals to return to the Reich or relocate to a neutral country. On Saturday, August 26th, the German government canceled the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Battle of Tannenberg, which had been used as a cover for a significant troop buildup in East Prussia. The aging battleship Schleswig-Holstein had arrived near Danzig the previous day, claiming to be on a goodwill visit, yet the Polish government had not been informed. Its hold was stocked with artillery shells poised to strike the Polish defenses at Westerplatte Peninsula by the Vistula River. Meanwhile, in Berlin that weekend, the people were enjoying the delightful weather. The beaches along the Grunewald by the Wannsee were teeming with sunbathers and swimmers, seemingly unaware of the looming war, even as news of impending rationing circulated. At the British Embassy, staff began to consume the champagne reserves from the cellar. They noted the increased troop presence in the streets, many sporting new yellow jackboots that lacked polish. The invasion had originally been scheduled for that day, but after being caught off guard by Britain and France's commitment to support Poland, Hitler had postponed it the night before. He was still looking for signs of doubt from Britain. In a twist of irony, a unit of Brandenburger commandos, unaware of the sudden change in plans, had pushed into Poland to secure a crucial bridge. The Polish viewed this as a provocation rather than a standard invasion attempt. Hitler, wanting to shift the blame to Poland, pretended to be open to negotiations with both Britain, France, and Poland. However, a farcical situation unfolded. He refused to provide any terms for discussion, didn't invite a representative from Warsaw, and imposed a deadline of midnight on August 30th. He also dismissed Mussolini's offer to mediate. On August 28th, he again instructed the army to prepare for an invasion on September 1st. Meanwhile, Ribbentrop made himself unavailable to both the Polish and British ambassadors, maintaining his usual detached demeanor, often staring off as though those around him weren't worth his attention. Finally, he agreed to meet Henderson at midnight on August 30th, just as the peace terms that had gone uncommunicated came to an end. Henderson pressed him for the details of these terms. Ribbentrop then presented a lengthy document, which, according to Henderson, he rushed through in German with evident annoyance. Once he finished, Henderson asked to see the document. Herr von Ribbentrop outright rejected the proposal, tossing the document onto the table with disdain, declaring it irrelevant since a Polish emissary had not arrived in Berlin by midnight. The following day, Hitler issued Directive No. 1 for Operation White, the planned invasion of Poland that had been in the works for the past 5 months. In Paris, there was a somber acceptance, haunted by the memory of over 1 million lives lost in the last war. Meanwhile, in Britain, the mass evacuation of children from London was set for September 1st, though most people still thought that the Nazi leader was simply bluffing. The Poles, however, had no such misconceptions. Yet in Warsaw, there were no signs of panic, only resolve. The Nazis' last-ditch effort to create a reason for war was a clear reflection of their methods. This act of deceitful propaganda had been orchestrated by Reinhard Heydrich, who served as deputy to Heinrich Himmler. Heydrich carefully assembled a group of his most trusted SS officers to stage an attack on a German customs station and a radio station near Gleiwitz, subsequently broadcasting a message in Polish. They planned to kill some drug prisoners from Sachsenhausen concentration camp, dressed in Polish uniforms, and leave their bodies as proof. On the afternoon of August 31st, Heydrich called the officer overseeing the operation to give the launch code, "Grandmother dead." It was hauntingly symbolic that the initial victims of the Second World War in Europe were concentration camp prisoners murdered for a fabricated story. In the early hours of September 1st, 1939, German troops were poised to invade Poland. For many, except for veterans of the First World War, this would be their first taste of combat. Like most soldiers, they reflected in the darkness on their chances of survival and whether they might bring dishonor to themselves. As they sat waiting to start their engines, a panzer commander near Silesia spoke of the eerie scene around him. The dark forest, the full moon, and a light mist create a surreal atmosphere. At 4:45 in the morning, the first shells were fired from the sea close to Danzig. The Schleswig-Holstein, a seasoned participant of the 1916 Battle of Jutland, had stealthily positioned itself off the Westerplatte Peninsula during the early hours of dawn. It targeted the Polish fortress with its powerful 280mm guns. A company of assault troops from the Kriegsmarine, concealed on the Schleswig-Holstein, landed but faced fierce resistance and were driven back. In Danzig, Polish volunteers rushed to defend the central post office at Heveliusplatz, but they were overwhelmed by Nazi stormtroopers, SS units, and regular forces covertly brought into the city. Almost all Polish defenders who survived the encounter were executed. Nazi flags replaced the old banners on public buildings. Church bells tolled as priests, teachers, and other prominent locals, along with many Jews, were rounded up. Work on the Stutthof concentration camp nearby ramped up to deal with the influx of prisoners. Later, Stutthof would provide bodies for experiments at the Danzig Anatomical Medical Institute, where human remains were processed for items like leather and soap. Hitler's delay of the invasion by 6 days allowed the Wehrmacht to mobilize and deploy an additional 21 infantry divisions and 2 motorized divisions. The German army now counted nearly 3 million men, 400,000 horses, and 200,000 vehicles. 1.5 million troops gathered at the Polish border, many carrying blank cartridges as a cover for their maneuvers. The true nature of their mission became clear when they were ordered to load live ammunition. Meanwhile, Poland's forces were not fully mobilized, as British and French governments had warned Warsaw that an early callop might provoke Hitler into action. The Poles postponed the general mobilization order until August 28, only to retract it the next day at the behest of British and French ambassadors, hoping for last-minute negotiations. The order was finally issued again on August 30th. These last-minute changes led to disarray, leaving only about a third of Poland's 1.3 million poorly armed soldiers ready by September 1st. Their only chance was to hold out until the French could initiate their promised offensive in the west. On the 19th day of May, General Maurice Gamelin, the commander-in-chief, assured that the French army would deploy the bulk of its forces by the 15th day after mobilization was ordered. However, both time and geography worked against the Poles. The Germans would quickly reach their core territory from East Prussia in the north, Pomerania and Silesia in the west, and German-dominated Slovakia in the south. Unaware of the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Polish government didn't fortify its eastern border effectively. The prospect of a coordinated invasion by Nazi and Soviet forces still seemed too politically unlikely. At 4:50 a.m. on the first day of September, As German troops prepared for their assault, they heard the rumble of planes approaching from behind. As the Stukas, Messerschmitts, and Heinkels flew overhead, they cheered, knowing the Luftwaffe was set to attack Polish airfields in a surprise strike. German soldiers had been warned by their leaders that the Poles would resort to unorthodox tactics, employing civilian snipers and sabotage. There was a belief that Polish Jews were sympathetic to the Bolsheviks and hostile towards the Germans. The Wehrmacht strategy was to invade Poland from the north, west, and east all at once. The goal was a swift and ruthless advance, deploying armored units and the Luftwaffe to catch the Poles off guard before they could organize proper defenses. Army Group North launched its assault from Pomerania and East Prussia with the aim of connecting across the Danzig corridor and moving southeast toward Warsaw. Meanwhile, Army Group South, led by Generaloberst Gerd von Rundstedt, was to quickly advance from southern Silesia toward Warsaw, operating on a wider front. The objective was for the two army groups to encircle most of the Polish army west of the Vistula. The 10th Army, at the heart of the southern advance, had the highest number of motorized units. To its right, the 14th Army advanced toward Krakow, while 3 mountain divisions, a panzer division, a motorized division, and 3 Slovak divisions pushed north from the German puppet state of Slovakia. On the morning of the invasion in central Berlin, SS guards lined the Wilhelmstrasse and Pariser Platz as Hitler moved from the Reichschancellery to the Kroll Opera House. This was where the Reichstag had convened after the infamous fire that had devastated the Parliament building shortly after the Nazis took power in 1933. He asserted that his reasonable demands on Poland, which he had never openly communicated to Warsaw, had been dismissed. That day, he revealed a 16-point peace plan in a cynical effort to blame the Warsaw government for the conflict. Amidst roaring cheers, he proclaimed the return of Danzig to the Reich. Dr. Karl Jakob Burckhardt, the League of Nations High Commissioner in the Free City, was compelled to leave. In London, after clarifying the facts of the invasion, Chamberlain ordered general mobilization. In the 10 days prior, Britain had started preliminary preparations for war. Chamberlain had been hesitant about full mobilization, fearing it might trigger a chain reaction in Europe like in 1914. Initially, the focus was on anti-aircraft and coastal defenses. However, when news of the German invasion broke, public sentiment shifted dramatically. No one could believe Hitler was bluffing anymore. The atmosphere in the country and in the House of Commons was far more resolute than it had been before the Munich crisis of the previous year. Nevertheless, the cabinet and the Foreign Office spent most of the day drafting an ultimatum demanding that Hitler pull his troops from Poland. Yet, even when it was completed, it didn't come off as a full ultimatum, since it lacked a definitive deadline. After receiving a report from their ambassador Robert Colandre in Berlin, Daladier ordered full mobilization for the next day. One attendee noted that the actual word for war was never spoken during the meeting. Instead, it was referred to through euphemisms. Instructions were also issued for evacuating children from both capitals. There was a widespread anticipation that hostilities would begin with large-scale bombing raids. That evening, a blackout was imposed in both capitals. In Paris, the news of the invasion was a shock, as hopes had risen in the previous days that a European conflict might be averted. Georges Bonnet, the foreign minister known for his extreme appeasement stance, pointed fingers at the Poles for their foolish and stubborn behavior. He was still keen on bringing Mussolini in as a mediator for another Munich-like agreement. Meanwhile, the general mobilization persisted. As trains loaded with reservists departed from Gare de l'Est in Paris, heading toward Metz and Strasbourg. Not surprisingly, the Polish government in Warsaw began to worry that the Allies might have lost their resolve once again. Even some politicians in London sensed uncertainty in the vague communication and the absence of a timeline, leading them to think Chamberlain might find a way to back out of the commitment to Poland. However, Britain and France were sticking to traditional diplomatic methods, almost to highlight their contrast with the advocate of undeclared blitzkrieg. In Berlin, the night of September 1st was unseasonably warm. Moonlight streamed over the darkened streets of the capital, now under blackout due to the threat of Polish air raids. Another form of blackout was enforced as Goebbels made it a serious offense to listen to foreign radio stations. Ribbentrop declined to meet with both the British and French ambassadors at once, so at 9:20 p.m., Henderson presented his note demanding the immediate withdrawal of German troops from Poland. Kullander submitted the French version half an hour later. Hitler, perhaps emboldened by the weak wording of the notes, maintained his belief that both governments would back down at the last moment. The following day, staff at the British Embassy said their goodbyes to their German employees before settling into the nearby Adlon Hotel. A sense of diplomatic uncertainty enveloped all three capitals. Concerns over renewed appeasement re-emerged in London, but the delay stemmed from a request by the French for more time to mobilize their reservists and evacuate civilians. Both governments understood the necessity of acting in unison, yet George Bonnet and his supporters continued to delay the critical moment. Unfortunately, the famously indecisive Daladier allowed Bonnet to persist in the idea of an international conference with the fascist regime in Rome. Bonnet called London to seek British backing, but both Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, and Chamberlain firmly stated that talks could not occur while German forces occupied Polish territory. Halifax also contacted the Italian Foreign Minister, Count Sciano, to clarify the stance on the matter. The lack of a time limit on the vague ultimatum had triggered a crisis in the cabinet in London later that afternoon. Chamberlain and Halifax argued the importance of standing with the French, leaving the final decision in their hands. However, the skeptics, supported by the chiefs of staff present, disagreed. They feared that without a strong British initiative, the French would remain passive. A deadline needed to be set. Chamberlain was even more unsettled by the reception he received in the House of Commons less than 3 hours later. His explanation for the delay in declaring war was met with silence that was anything but supportive. When Arthur Greenwood, standing in as the Labour Party leader, rose to respond, even loyal Conservatives shouted, "Speak for England." Greenwood made it clear that Chamberlain must answer to the House the very next morning. That night, as a storm raged outside, Chamberlain and Halifax called for the French ambassador, Charles Corbin, to come to Downing Street. They reached out to Paris to speak with Daladier and Bonnet. The French government still preferred not to be rushed, even though Daladier had just received full support for war credits in the Chambre des députés hours earlier. The mention of the word war was still avoided in French official discussions, with phrases like obligations de la situation internationale being used instead. With Chamberlain convinced that his government would fall the next morning if a clear ultimatum wasn't presented, Daladier finally agreed that France could not afford to delay any longer. He assured that France's ultimatum would also be delivered the following day. Chamberlain then convened the British cabinet. Shortly before midnight, a final ultimatum was crafted and approved. It was set to be delivered at 9 o'clock in the morning the next day by Sir Neville Henderson in Berlin, and it would expire 2 hours later. On the morning of Sunday, September 3rd, Sir Neville Henderson executed his orders precisely. Hitler, who had been repeatedly reassured by Ribbentrop that the British would back down, appeared visibly taken aback. After the text was presented to him, there was a lengthy silence. Eventually, he turned furiously to Ribbentrop and demanded, "What now?" Ribbentrop, an arrogant pretender whose own mother-in-law labeled him an extremely dangerous fool, had confidently assured Hitler he understood Britain's response. Now he found himself speechless. Later, after Kullander presented France's ultimatum, Göring remarked to Hitler's interpreter, "If we lose this war, may heaven have mercy on us." Following the stormy night, London greeted the morning with clear, sunny skies. By the time Big Ben chimed 11, Berlin had yet to respond to the ultimatum. Henderson in Berlin confirmed via phone that he had received no word either. In the Chancery, a third secretary halted the clock at 11 and affixed a note to its glass face stating it would remain stopped until Hitler was defeated. At 11:15, Chamberlain addressed the nation from the cabinet room at 10 Downing Street. Across the country, people stood when the national anthem played at the conclusion. Many were in tears. The Prime Minister spoke with both simplicity and eloquence, yet his sadness and fatigue were evident to many listeners. Just after his brief address, air raid sirens began to wail, driving people into cellars and shelters, anticipating waves of enemy aircraft overhead. Thankfully, it was a false alarm, and the all-clear soon sounded. A typical British reaction followed. They put the kettle on for tea. However, the mood wasn't universally calm, as a report from the research group Mass Observation noted that nearly every town of any significance was rumored to be reduced to rubble during the early days of war. Eyewitnesses claimed to have seen planes descending in flames. Troops in 3-ton army trucks sang "It's a Long Way to Tipperary," a tune that, despite its cheerful melody, stirred memories of the First World War's horrors. London began its wartime preparations. In Hyde Park, across from Knightsbridge Barracks, steam shovels started excavating earth for sandbags to protect government buildings. The King's Guard at Buckingham Palace had swapped their bearskins and scarlet tunics for steel helmets and military fatigues, creased to perfection. Silver barrage balloons floated over the city, dramatically altering the skyline, while red pillar boxes displayed yellow patches of paint designed to detect poison gas. Windows were covered with strips of adhesive paper to minimize the risk of shattering glass. The crowd transformed as well, with an increase in uniforms and civilians carrying their gas masks in cardboard boxes. Railway stations overflowed with evacuated children, each wearing a luggage tag showing their names and addresses, holding on to rag dolls and teddy bears. At night, under the blackout, nothing was familiar. Only a handful of drivers ventured out, cautiously using dimmed headlights. Many chose to stay home, tuning in to the BBC on their radios, hidden behind blackout blinds. Australia and New Zealand declared war on Germany that day, followed by India's British-led government, which did so without consulting local leaders. South Africa would declare war 3 days later after a government change, and Canada officially joined the conflict the following week. That night, the British liner Athenia was torpedoed by the German submarine U-30, resulting in 112 casualties, including 28 North Americans. Overlooked was Chamberlain's reluctant choice to invite his fiercest critic into the government. Churchill's return to the Admiralty, where he had served at the beginning of the last war, led the First Sea Lord to signal the Royal Navy. Winston is back. In Berlin, there was little celebration at the news of Britain's declaration of war. Most Germans felt stunned and disheartened. They had relied on Hitler's streak of boldness to secure victory over Poland without escalating into a larger European conflict. Despite Bonnet's attempts to stall, the French ultimatum, which cleverly avoided using the word war, expired at 5 p.m. The general sentiment in France was one of resignation. It must be got over with. While the anti-militarist left shared the defeatists' view on the right that they didn't want to die for Danzig. Even more troubling, some senior French officers began to feel that the British had coerced them into war. General Paul de Villaume, the chief liaison officer with the government, wrote that it was to present them with a fait accompli because the English feared they might go soft. 9 months later, he would exert a notably defeatist influence on the next Prime Minister, Paul Renault. The news of the dual war declarations ignited scenes of wild celebration in Warsaw. Unaware of any doubts from the French, jubilant Poles flocked to the embassies. The national anthems of the Allies echoed over the radio, fueling a hopeful spirit that led many to believe the anticipated French offensive would quickly turn the tide in their favor. However, darker moments unfolded in other areas as some Poles sought vengeance against their ethnic German neighbors for the invasion. Amid the fear and chaos unleashed by the sudden onset of war, ethnic Germans faced attacks in several locations. On September 3rd in Bydgoszcz, indiscriminate gunfire erupted against Poles, culminating in a massacre that claimed the lives of 223 ethnic Germans, though German accounts exaggerate this number to 1,000. Estimates of ethnic Germans killed across Poland range from 2,000 to 13,000, with the most credible figure being around 6,000. Goebbels later inflated this total to 58,000 to rationalize the German program of ethnic cleansing against Poles. On that initial day of the European conflict, the German Fourth Army, advancing from Pomerania, secured the Danzig corridor at its widest point, effectively reintegrating East Prussia with the Reich. They also established a bridgehead across the lower Vistula. Simultaneously, the Third Army from East Prussia pushed southeast toward the river Naro, aiming to outflank Modlin and Warsaw. Meanwhile, Army Group South drove back the forces near Wood and Krakow, inflicting significant casualties. The Luftwaffe, having neutralized most of the Polish Air Force, shifted its focus to supporting ground troops and targeting cities behind Polish lines to disrupt communications. German soldiers expressed horror and disdain at the state of the impoverished Polish villages they encountered, which appeared largely empty of Poles but populated by Jews. Many soldiers described the villages as shockingly dirty and very backward. Their reactions intensified upon seeing Eastern Jews with beards and kaftans. The physical characteristics perceived evasive eyes and overly friendly mannerisms as they respectfully removed their hats seemed to align more closely with the distorted portrayals found in the viciously anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer than with the assimilated Jewish neighbors they had known back in Germany. Every individual, as noted by a Gefreiter, was compelled to become an unwavering adversary of the Jews. Regular German soldiers, not only those in the SS, eagerly abused Jews, inflicting beatings, shaving the beards of the elderly, humiliating and assaulting young women, and igniting synagogues. Soldiers were especially mindful of the warnings they had received regarding the threats of sabotage and the risk of being shot by insurgents. If a solitary gunshot was heard, any nearby Jews were often viewed with suspicion, despite the fact that attacks were more likely to originate from Poles. Several massacres occurred after a jittery guard fired a shot, prompting others to join in, sometimes resulting in German troops mistakenly shooting one another. Officers were horrified by the lack of control over firing, but felt powerless to halt what they described as a psychosis driven by fear of armed civilians. However, few officers took significant action to prevent the ensuing acts of blind vengeance. Grenades were thrown into cellars, where families rather than partisans sought refuge. Soldiers justified these actions as self-defense, not war crimes. The German military's long-standing fixation with insurgents paved the way for summary executions and the destruction of villages. Most units did not bother with legal processes, believing that Poles and Jews did not warrant such considerations. Some units inflicted more violence than others, with the SS division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, associated with the Führer's bodyguard, being particularly notorious. Nevertheless, much of the killing was executed behind the lines by the SS Einsatzgruppen, the security police, and the Volksdeutscher Selbstschutz militia, all seeking vengeance. German reports indicate that over 16,000 civilians were executed in the course of a 5-week campaign, although the actual number may have reached around 65,000 by year's end. Ethnic German militias massacred approximately 10,000 Poles and Jews in gravel pits near Mniszek, and another 8,000 in a forest near Karlshof. Homes and sometimes entire villages were set ablaze as collective punishment, leading to the destruction of over 500 villages and towns. In certain areas, the path of the German advance could be seen at night by the ominous red glow on the horizon from burning villages and farms. Soon, both Jews and Poles sought refuge whenever German troops arrived. This heightened the soldiers' anxiety, as they felt they were being monitored from hidden spots, convinced that concealed weapons were aimed at them. It often appeared that many soldiers yearned to obliterate these unhealthy and unfriendly villages, fearing that the infection they represented in their minds could spread into Germany. Nevertheless, this didn't deter them from seizing every chance to loot money, clothes, jewelry, food, and bedding. In a troubling twist of logic, the hostility they faced during their invasion seemed to validate the invasion itself. The Polish army, despite showing tremendous bravery, was greatly hindered not only by outdated weaponry, but also by a critical lack of radios. This absence meant they could not communicate vital movements of formations, leading to catastrophic outcomes. Marshal Rids, the chief commander, already believed the war was lost. Even if the French launched their intended offensive, it would arrive too late. On September 4th, a more self-assured Hitler informed Goebbels that he did not worry about an attack from the west, predicting a stagnant potato war there. The historic university city of Krakow fell on September 6th to the 14th Army, and Rundstedt's Army Group South pressed on as Polish defenders struggled in their retreat. However, just 3 days later, the Army's high command grew anxious that Polish forces might be sidestepping the planned encirclement west of the Vistula. Thus, 2 corps from Army Group North were ordered to advance further east, if needed, to the River Bug and beyond to trap them along a secondary line. Near Danzig, the valiant Polish defenders at Westerplatte, having depleted their ammunition, were overwhelmed on September 7th by Stukas and the heavy artillery of the Schleswig-Holstein. The battleship then headed north to assist in the assault on the port of Dynia, which held out until September 19th. In central Poland, resistance stiffened as the Germans drew closer to the capital. On September 10th, a column from the 4th Panzer Division reached the outskirts of the city, but had to retreat swiftly. The Polish resolve to defend Warsaw was evident as they concentrated their artillery on the east bank of the Vistula, ready to fire at their own city. The next day, on September 11th, the Soviet Union pulled its ambassador and diplomatic staff out of Warsaw, yet the Poles remained unaware of the treachery brewing from the east. In other areas, German encirclement strategies using mechanized troops were already capturing large numbers of Polish soldiers. By September 16th, the Germans initiated a significant encirclement battle 80 kilometers east of Warsaw, trapping 2 Polish armies between the Bzura and Vistula rivers. Ultimately, Polish resistance crumbled under intense Luftwaffe attacks on troop formations, resulting in approximately 120,000 prisoners taken. The valiant Polish Air Force, armed with just 159 outdated fighters, stood no chance against the advanced Messerschmitts. Any remaining hopes among the Poles for salvation through a Western Allied offensive quickly diminished. General Gamlin, backed by French Prime Minister Daladier, was hesitant to take action until the British Expeditionary Force was fully deployed, and all reservists were mobilized. He contended that France needed to acquire military supplies from the United States and maintained that the French military approach was inherently defensive. Despite pledging support to Poland, Gamlin was reluctant to entertain plans for a major offensive, fearing that the Rhine Valley and Germany's West Wall defense lines were insurmountable. The British took a similarly passive stance, referring to the West Wall as the Siegfried Line, the same line they joked about wanting to hang their laundry on during the Phoney War. They believed time favored them, operating under the flawed assumption that a blockade of Germany was their optimal strategy, even though the Soviet Union could easily help Hitler secure the resources needed for war. Many in Britain felt a deep sense of shame over the lack of proactive measures to aid Poland. The RAF began aerial operations over Germany, dropping propaganda leaflets, which led to jokes about Mein Kampf and the Confetti War. A bombing mission on the German naval base at Wilhelmshaven on September 4th turned out to be embarrassingly ineffective. Advance units of the British Expeditionary Force arrived in France on the same day, and over the next 5 weeks, a total of 158,000 soldiers crossed the Channel. However, there were no encounters with German troops until December. The French managed to push just a few kilometers into German territory near Saarbrücken. Initially, the Germans were apprehensive about a large-scale attack. Hitler, with most of his forces in Poland, was particularly anxious, but the minor nature of the offensive soon made it clear that this was merely a symbolic action. The High Command of the Armed Forces, known as OKW, soon eased their concerns. No troops needed to be redeployed. The French and British had shamefully neglected their responsibilities, especially since the Poles had already provided Britain and France with their versions of the German Enigma machine back in July. On September 17th, Poland's suffering was sealed as Soviet troops crossed its long eastern border in accordance with a secret agreement made in Moscow less than a month earlier. The Germans were surprised that the Soviets hadn't acted sooner, but Stalin had figured that an early attack might compel the Western Allies to declare war on the Soviet Union. The Soviets, with their usual cynicism, claimed that Polish provocations forced them to step in to protect ethnic Belarusians and Ukrainians. Furthermore, the Kremlin asserted that their non-aggression pact with Poland was void since the Polish government no longer existed. While it was true that the Polish government had fled Warsaw that very morning to avoid encirclement by Soviet forces, they were racing to the Romanian border to evade capture from advancing Red Army units. The traffic jam of military vehicles and civilian cars at the border was overwhelming, but eventually the defeated Poles were allowed to pass that night. Most carried away a handful of soil or a stone from Poland as they left. Many were in tears, and some took their own lives. Though the Romanian citizens showed kindness to the exiles, their government faced pressure from Germany to return the Poles. Bribes spared most from arrest and internment, except if the officer in charge supported the fascist Iron Guard. Some Poles managed to escape in small groups. Larger groups, organized by the Polish authorities in Bucharest, departed from Constanza and other Black Sea ports on their journey to France. Some fled through Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Greece, while a smaller number encountered more obstacles and traveled north to the Baltic states before reaching Sweden. Following Hitler's orders, the OKW quickly directed German units beyond the Bug to prepare for withdrawal. Close collaboration between Berlin and Moscow ensured that the German pullbacks from territories designated for the Soviet Union were synchronized with the advancing Red Army units. The first interaction between these unlikely allies occurred north of Brest-Litovsk. On September 22nd, the grand fortress of Brest-Litovsk was formally surrendered to the Red Army in a ceremonial display. Sadly for the Soviet officers involved, this meeting with German counterparts later made them targets for arrest by Beria's NKVD. Polish resistance persisted as encircled units endeavored to escape, and isolated soldiers banded together to continue fighting in the more remote, rugged terrains of forest, marsh, and mountains. The roads heading east were overwhelmed with refugees using farm carts, worn-out vehicles, and even bicycles to flee the conflict. A young Polish soldier recounted, "The enemy always came from the air, and even when they flew low, they remained out of reach of our old Mausers. The sights of war quickly became monotonous. Day in and day out, we witnessed the same scenes. Civilians scrambling to escape air raids, convoys breaking apart, trucks or carts in flames. The odor along the road was unchanging as well, the stench of dead horses left unburied filling the air. We moved only by night and learned to sleep while on the go. Smoking was prohibited, fearing that the flicker of a cigarette could draw the all-powerful Luftwaffe upon us." Meanwhile, Warsaw stood as the main stronghold of Polish resistance. Hitler grew impatient for the city's capture, prompting the Luftwaffe to launch intense bombing campaigns. With minimal opposition in the skies and the city lacking effective anti-aircraft measures, on September 20th, the Luftwaffe targeted Warsaw and Modlin with 620 aircraft. The following day, Göring ordered both the 1st and 4th Air Fleets to conduct large-scale attacks. The bombing escalated relentlessly, with the Luftwaffe even deploying Junkers 52 transport planes to unleash incendiaries, until Warsaw capitulated on October 1st. The unbearable odor of corpses trapped beneath debris and the decomposing horses littering the streets intensified. Around 25,000 civilians and 6,000 soldiers lost their lives in these assaults. On September 28th, while Warsaw faced relentless bombardment, Ribbentrop returned to Moscow to sign an additional boundary and friendship treaty with Stalin, implementing various changes to the boundary line. This agreement granted the Soviet Union nearly all of Lithuania in exchange for a minor expansion of German-occupied Polish territory. Ethnic Germans residing in Soviet-controlled areas would be relocated to Nazi territories, and Stalin's regime also surrendered numerous German communists and other political adversaries. Subsequently, both governments declared an end to the European war, now that the Polish question was settled. It's clear who benefited most from the agreements that constituted the Nazi-Soviet pact. Facing a looming naval blockade by Britain, Germany was now poised to acquire everything necessary to sustain the war effort. Beyond the resources supplied by the Soviet Union, such as grain, oil, and manganese essential for steel-making, Stalin's administration also served as a channel for other materials, particularly rubber, which Germany could not acquire elsewhere. Concurrent with the negotiations in Moscow, the Soviets began to exert pressure on the Baltic states. On September 28th, a mutual assistance treaty was imposed on Estonia, followed by Latvia and Lithuania, which were coerced into similar agreements within the next 2 weeks. Despite Stalin's personal vows to uphold their sovereignty, all three nations were absorbed into the Soviet Union the following summer, and the NKVD initiated the deportation of around 25,000 undesirables. The Nazis accepted Stalin's annexation of the Baltic states and his acquisition of Bessarabia from Romania. However, they perceived his desire to dominate the Black Sea coast and the mouth of the Danube near the Ploesti oil fields not only as provocative, but also menacing. Polish resistance lingered into October, yet the scale of the defeat was brutal. Estimates suggest that Polish forces battling the Germans suffered approximately 70,000 fatalities, 133,000 injuries, and 700,000 captured. German casualties totaled around 44,400, with 11,000 of those being fatalities. The small Polish air force was decimated, yet the Luftwaffe faced significant losses of 560 aircraft during the campaign, primarily due to crashes and ground fire. The casualty figures from the Soviet invasion are sobering. It's reported that the Red Army experienced 996 fatalities and 2,002 injuries, whereas Poland suffered around 50,000 fatalities, with no available figures for the wounded. This stark contrast may be attributed to executions, possibly including the massacres that occurred the following spring, like the one in the Katy Forest. Hitler delayed announcing the demise of the Polish state, hoping in October to prompt the British and French to negotiate. The absence of an Allied offensive in the West to assist the Poles led him to believe that neither the British nor, particularly, the French were eager to persist in the conflict. On October 5th, after attending a victory parade in Warsaw alongside General Major Erwin Rommel, he addressed foreign journalists, stating, "Gentlemen, you have witnessed the devastation of Warsaw. Let this be a cautionary tale for the statesmen in London and Paris who still contemplate continuing the war." The following day, he presented a peace offer in the Reichstag. However, when both Allied governments rejected it, and it became evident that the Soviet Union aimed to obliterate any Polish identity in its territory, Hitler ultimately decided to annihilate Poland entirely. Under German occupation, Poland was split between its general government in the central and southwestern regions and areas designated for incorporation into the Reich, such as Danzig, West Prussia, and East Prussia in the north, the Wartheland in the west, and Upper Silesia in the south. A massive ethnic cleansing initiative was launched to clear the Germanized regions, aimed at resettling Volksdeutsche from the Baltic states, Romania, and other Balkan regions. Polish cities underwent renaming. Łódź was transformed into Litzmannstadt, honoring a German general from the First World War, while Poznan regained its Prussian name, Posen, becoming the capital of the Warthegau. The Catholic Church, a symbol of national pride in Poland, faced relentless persecution with priests being arrested and deported. To eradicate Polish culture and stifle future leadership, schools and universities were shut down, allowing only the most rudimentary education, just enough to create a subservient class. In November, professors and staff from Krakow University were taken to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Polish political prisoners were relocated to a former cavalry barracks in Oświęcim, now known as Auschwitz. Nazi officials began selecting large groups of Poles for labor in Germany, including young women to serve as domestic help. Hitler instructed General Walther von Brauchitsch that they needed cheap slaves and aimed to rid the newly acquired territories of what he called rabble. Children who fit the Aryan ideal, blonde-haired and blue-eyed, were taken to Germany for adoption. Albert Förster, the regional leader of Danzig, West Prussia, stirred controversy among Nazi purists by allowing many Poles to be reclassified as ethnic Germans. While this was a humiliating insult, it provided the only chance for many to evade deportation and keep their homes. However, these men soon found themselves drafted into the Wehrmacht. On October 4th, Hitler issued an amnesty for troops who had killed prisoners and civilians, justifying their actions as stemming from bitterness over atrocities committed by Poles. This led to discomfort among some officers who perceived a decline in military discipline. One artillery battalion commander remarked on the grim reality of German soldiers committing acts of burning, looting, and murder without regard for their actions or the standards of the German military. General Johannes Blaskowitz, who led the Eighth Army, strongly protested against the killing of civilians by the SS and their auxiliaries. When Hitler learned of his memo, he angrily declared that one cannot conduct a war in a manner akin to the Salvation Army. He dismissed any further objections from the army with contempt. Nonetheless, many German officers maintained a belief that Poland was undeserving of existence, and very few had opposed the invasion on moral grounds. Many older officers, having come from the Freikorps that battled against the Poles during the chaotic aftermath of the First World War, had first-hand experience in fierce confrontations, particularly in Silesia. In many respects, the Polish campaign and its consequences served as a trial for Hitler's later race war against the Soviet Union. Approximately 45,000 Polish and Jewish civilians were executed, primarily by regular German soldiers. The SS Einsatzgruppen executed patients in mental asylums. Each army had an Einsatzgruppe assigned to its rear area, known as Operation Tannenberg, tasked with capturing and even eliminating aristocrats, judges, notable journalists, professors, and anyone else who might emerge as a leader for future Polish resistance. On September 19th, SS Obergruppenführer Heydrich openly informed General der Artillerie Franz Halder that there would be a clear-out of Jews, intellectuals, priests, and the aristocracy. Initially, the terror was chaotic, particularly that inflicted by the ethnic German militia, but by the year's end, it became more organized and purposeful. Though Hitler's hatred for Jews never wavered, the systematic genocide that began in 1942 hadn't always been part of his agenda. He reveled in his intense anti-Semitism, fostering the belief that Europe needed to be cleansed of all Jewish influence. However, his pre-war plans had not included outright extermination. Instead, they focused on creating unbearable oppression to drive Jews into exile. Nazi policies regarding the Jewish question were inconsistent. The term policy is somewhat misleading when considering the chaotic structure of the Third Reich. Hitler's dismissive stance on administration allowed for a proliferation of competing departments and ministries. Rivalries, particularly among the Gauleiters, other Nazi officials, the SS, and the army, resulted in a staggering lack of cohesion that contradicted the regime's image of brutal efficiency. Seizing on a random remark from the Führer or attempting to predict his desires, contenders for his favor would initiate programs without consulting other relevant organizations. On September 21, 1939, Heydrich issued an order outlining preliminary measures for addressing Poland's Jewish population, which numbered about 3.5 million before the invasion, making up 10% of the population, the highest proportion in Europe. The Soviet zone housed around 1.5 million people, a number that included the 350,000 Jews who had fled eastward from the advancing German armies. Heydrich directed that those remaining in German territories should be grouped in larger cities with convenient rail connections. A significant population relocation was anticipated. On October 30th, Himmler ordered the forced transportation of all Jews in the Warthegau to the General Government. Their homes would then be allocated to Volksdeutsche settlers, individuals who had never lived within the Reich and whose German was often described as difficult to understand. Hans Frank, the domineering and corrupt Nazi leader overseeing the General Government from a royal castle in Krakow, was furious upon learning he had to prepare for the arrival of several 100,000 Jews along with displaced Poles. No arrangements had been made for housing or feeding these individuals, and there was little thought given to their fate. In principle, those Jews who were able would be put to forced labor, while the rest would be confined in temporary ghettos in the larger cities until resettlement could occur. Those trapped in the ghettos, without money and facing severe food shortages, often succumbed to starvation and illness. While this was not yet a plan for total extermination, it marked a crucial step toward that end. As the challenges of relocating Jews to an unspecified colony became more pronounced, the notion that killing them might be simpler than moving them began to take hold. Conditions for those living in Nazi-occupied areas were horrendous, but life for Poles on the Soviet side of the newly drawn frontier was hardly any better. Stalin's animosity toward Poland dated back to the Soviet-Polish War and the Red Army's defeat at the Battle of Warsaw in 1920, an event the Poles dubbed the Miracle on the Vistula. Stalin faced significant backlash for his part in the failure of the 1st Cavalry Army to support Marshal M. N. Tukhachevsky's forces, whom he had falsely executed in 1937 during his purge of the Red Army. Throughout the 1930s, the NKVD targeted many Poles in the Soviet Union as suspected spies, primarily those aligned with communism. Nikolai Yezhov, then head of the NKVD during the Great Terror, became fixated on imaginary Polish plots. Poles in the NKVD were targeted, and on August 11, 1937, Order 00485 labeled them as state enemies. When Yezhov reported after the first 20 days filled with arrests, torture, and executions, Stalin commended his efforts, saying, "Very good. Keep unearthing and purging this Polish filth. Remove it for the good of the Soviet Union." During the anti-Polish campaign of the Great Terror, over 143,000 people were arrested on charges of espionage, with more than 111,000 executed. Poles were approximately 40 times more likely to face execution than other Soviet citizens. Following the Treaty of Riga in 1921, which concluded the Soviet-Polish War, Poland claimed western areas of Belarusia and Ukraine, settling them with many of Marshal Józef Piłsudski's legionnaires. However, after the Red Army invaded in the fall of 1939, over 5 million Poles came under Soviet control, which deemed Polish patriotism inherently counter-revolutionary. The NKVD arrested about 109,400 individuals, with most sent to the harsh labor camps of the Gulag, and 8,513 executed. The authorities specifically targeted those who could sustain Polish nationalism, including landowners, lawyers, educators, clergy, journalists, and military officers. It represented a calculated strategy of class warfare and national eradication. Eastern Poland, whose control was taken by the Red Army, was destined to be divided and absorbed into the Soviet Union, with the northern section becoming part of Belarusia and the southern region joining Ukraine. Mass deportations to Siberia or Central Asia commenced on February 10, 1940. The NKVD rifle regiments detained nearly 140,000 Polish civilians in freezing temperatures. Families awakened to shouts and the sound of rifle butts banging on their doors. Red Army soldiers or Ukrainian militias, commanded by an NKVD officer, barged in, guns drawn, hurling threats. Beds were overturned and cupboards rifled through, supposedly in search of hidden weapons. "You are Polish elite," an NKVD agent told the Amchik family. "You are Polish lords and masters. You are enemies of the people." The NKVD often labeled them with the phrase, "Once a Pole, always a kulak," a derogatory term for a wealthy and reactionary peasant. Families had little time to prepare for the horrific journey, leaving their homes and farms behind forever, with most feeling paralyzed by the impending ordeal. Fathers and sons were made to kneel with their faces to the wall, while the women were permitted to gather essential items, like a sewing machine, to earn a living wherever they ended up: cooking utensils, bedding, family photographs, a child's rag doll, and school books. Some Soviet soldiers seemed visibly uncomfortable with their orders and offered quiet apologies. A few families were given the chance to milk their cow or to slaughter some chickens or a piglet for food on the 3-week journey in cattle wagons. Everything else had to be abandoned. The Polish diaspora was underway.